The following is a paper entitled Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Revisited, written by Dennis Merritt, Kevin Liu, and Frazer Merritt. It appears in Psychological Perspectives, Volume 65, Issue 3-4. To access the paper, which includes all references, please see the link in the notes below. Abstract. The publication of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in January of 1886 created a shock-wave in the consciousness of its readers. It was an instant success in and beyond the literary world, as people were confronted with the uneasy thought that evil originated within the individual and not from an external source like the devil. This was 9 years before Freud conducted his first psychoanalysis, and decades before Jung introduced the concept of the shadow. Stevenson was known as the author of Treasure Island and children's poetry, but had long been looking for a vehicle to write about the strange other he had been aware of since his childhood nightmares. The inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde came directly from a dream, and he attributed most of his literary success to help from the Brownies, the little people, in his interior world and dreamland. The novel can be viewed in relation to the love-hate relationship with his father, whom he depended upon for financial support during his lifelong struggles with severe respiratory illness, which led to drug addiction from his attempts to cope with the illness. For Stevenson, the other was primarily the dark side of the strict Calvinistic religion of his father and proper late 19th century Scottish culture. Yet the concept is even more relevant today as we face the evils of terrorism, racism, white-collar crime, Putin and rising authoritarianism, and intolerable levels of polarization in many modern societies. Introduction. February 24, 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. January 6, 2021. Insurrection in the U.S. Capitol. September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda terrorist attack. These tragedies were, to a significant degree, the result of ignorance regarding the human psyche. Evil that is not recognized within us gets projected, resulting in horrific treatment and atrocities against the other. This is one of the key lessons of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Published 136 years ago, Stevenson's novel shocked the world. Yet now in the 21st century, the deeper implications of his disturbing vision continue to haunt us. His brilliance was to illustrate that evil originated within the mind, not externally or from the devil. In our attempts to suppress this evil, it only grows more powerful. The novel's message is, in too many ways, more relevant today than ever. It would be wise to revisit the story's deeper meaning and psychological import. Unlike other literary works that took the public decades to fully understand and appreciate, such as Herman Melville's Moby Dick or F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Stevenson's novel struck a global cultural nerve. Within 6 months after publication in January of 1886, it had sold 40,000 copies in Britain and 250,000 copies in North America. It catapulted Stevenson to celebrity stardom, and with his face splashed across newspapers and gossip rags, the public was Lewis mad for the greatest author living. People who weren't normally fiction readers loved it. Ministers sermonized about it, and it became the subject of leading articles in religious papers. It was, in other words, an instant classic, and the Jekyll and Hyde character entered into the collective consciousness. But what accounts for the novel's astonishing success? The construct of this novel casts the reader in a detective role, trying to solve the strange case that is really themselves and every other human, and demands we investigate how we hide the dark sides of our nature in the hopes of upholding an acceptable and morally upright persona. The story follows a respectable late 19th century Victorian doctor of a Calvinist persuasion, who is developing a drug that will isolate and dissociate his dark side, thereby enabling him to live unencumbered and be purer in his public appearance. Mr. Hyde grows in strength after several transmutations, until he commits wanton evil and can no longer be prevented from overtaking Dr. Jekyll's consciousness. When a friend discovers his dark secret, the good doctor fears public humiliation and commits suicide. The story ends with a confessional letter written by Jekyll before his death, explaining why he conducted the experiment and how it became uncontrollable. This hits the reader with a heavy dose of psychic reality about the evil lurking in each of us, and the necessity of constructing a persona that more closely aligns with the values and ethical imperatives of the archetypal self. In his suicide note, Jekyll confides a belief that all humans are a commingling of good and evil, and the evil that is Edward Hyde is the lethal side of man. There was a certain lack of vitality and freedom in Jekyll's life, whereas Hyde lived an electrifying existence. What began as undignified pleasures for Mr. Hyde quickly morphed into vicarious depravity. He became a being inherently malign and villainous, totally self-centered and drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another. His mind became consumed with fear and hatred, twisting him into a child of hell. Stevenson used his considerable writing skills to convey the frightening dimensions of events that were, in fact, based on real-life experiences. He had been obsessed since childhood with Scotland's most notorious psychopath, William Brodie, an heir to a family fortune and known to all as a deacon, head tradesman, and powerful politician in Stevenson's hometown of Edinburgh. Brodie lived a double life, indulging in alcohol, prostitutes, cockfights, and robbery. Stevenson admired Brodie's subversion of authority, particularly since Stevenson detested the hypocritical Calvinist society of the late 1800s and the grim severity of his Calvinist parents. During his rebellious university phase, he lived a bohemian lifestyle, haunting the same taverns and brothels that Brodie had frequented 100 years earlier, drinking excessively, abusing opium, and even dressing like the infamous criminal. But the rebellion was short-lived. At age 22, Stevenson had a severe relapse of a respiratory illness, which, since childhood, had often suspended him in a liminal near-death realm. After his health failed, Stevenson became dependent on his father's money and addictive drug cocktails to stay alive. Morphine, chloroform ether, but especially laudanum, a combination of opium and alcohol, led Stevenson into a tortuous life of enduring the agonies and ecstasies of drug addiction. This played out in confessional form, with Hyde's character coming to dominate Jekyll's consciousness, and, it is theorized, was responsible for Stevenson's death at age 44 of a cerebral hemorrhage, possibly a consequence of years of opioid abuse. In a case of life imitating art, Jekyll's decline can be seen as a metaphor of an addict becoming hooked on a drug transformation until one loses control and the addiction takes over. The message of the novel is clear. If you remove all restraints, evil will emerge and eventually dominate, with deadly consequences. Jekyll and Hyde are alive today in America with the Sackler family, owners of the now bankrupt Purdue Pharma that produced OxyContin, an addictive opioid pain medication. The family profited by $12 to $13 billion and supported the company's push to increase sales representatives' visits to doctors and other prescribers when profits began to drop at one point. Political contributions ensured that politicians crippled the government's ability to monitor and investigate towns and cities with exorbitant sales of OxyContin, as well as find and punish doctors who overprescribed. Company data on the drug's addictive nature was suppressed, a costly omission that led to the loss of 930,000 lives since 1999, devastating millions of families and friends. In addition, U.S. economic losses are estimated at $631 billion over a 4-year period. The Jekyll persona side portrays a successful corporate family known for huge philanthropic contributions. This masked the Hyde shadow side that produced a heinous death toll and inflicted untold misery upon millions. This is more than white-collar crime. This is white-collar evil. In 1885, at age 35, Stevenson was in torment during one of his ill phases and heavily abusing laudanum when he awoke from a nightmare that became the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He dreamt a man was being pursued for a crime and pressed into a cabinet where he swallowed a powder and, in front of his pursuers, changed into another being. Stevenson had a cabinet in his childhood bedroom. It had been made by William Brodie. For years he had been looking for a vehicle to write about the other. That strong sense of a man's double being, which must at times come in upon and overwhelm the mind of every thinking creature. Upon waking, Stevenson said, I had found the missing link, and before I again went to sleep, almost every detail of the story as it stands was clear to me. He worked feverishly on the story, and had it ready for the printer within 10 weeks. Stevenson willingly gave credit to the world of dreams as inspiration for his writings, as dreams provided his most profound experiences of the other, that liminal and imaginal space out of which he wrote. He first encountered the other through his many near-death experiences in childhood during his illnesses, and his experience of the other side of the bourgeois Calvinist society of his parents. He gives a detailed description of his experience of the dream world in his essay, a chapter on dreams, which referenced his childhood nightmares, as well as a nightmare in his college years that left him with substantial anxiety during the day and a sense that he led a double life, one of the day, one of the night, one that he had every reason to believe was the true one, another that he had no means of proving to be false. Jung's own struggle between what he called personality number one, consciousness, represented by the predictability of his father, and personality number two, the unconscious, represented by the unpredictability of his mother, immediately comes to mind. Stevenson's father invented tales to help young Robert fall asleep, but when he became a writer, he had what he called the little people, his Brownies, who manufactured his dreams and helped him to develop marketable tales. Stevenson gave this description of his relationship to the Brownies. I am sometimes tempted to suppose he is no storyteller at all, but a creature as matter-of-fact as any cheesemonger or any cheese, and a realist bemirred up to my ears in actuality, so that, by that account, the whole of my published fiction should be the single-handed product of some Brownie, some familiar, some unseen collaborator, whom I keep locked in a back garret, while I get all the praise and he but a share of the pudding. I am an excellent adviser. I pull back and I cut down, and I dress the whole in the best words and sentences that I can find and make. I hold the pen, too, and I do the sitting at the table, which is about the worst of it. And when all is done, I make up the manuscript and pay for the registration, so that, on the whole, I have some claim to share, though not so largely as I do, in the profits of our common enterprise. His description of his part in the writing process aligns with Jung's reflections of the role of the individual in the creation of visionary art. Jung writes, "One might also describe it, a work of art, as a living being that uses man only as a nutrient medium, employing his capacities according to its own laws and shaping itself to the fulfillment of its own creative purpose. While his conscious mind stands amazed and empty before this phenomenon, he is overwhelmed by a flood of thoughts and images which he never intended to create, and which his own will could never have brought into being. Here the artist is not identical with the process of creation. He is aware that he is subordinate to his work and stands outside it, as though he were a second person, or as though a person other than himself had fallen within the magic circle of an alien will." Stevenson's characterization of the Brownies mirrors the little people in our dreams Jung talked about, and Jung's view that the deeper unconscious is an amoral realm. As Stevenson wrote, "I do most of the morality, worse luck, and my Brownies have not a rudiment of what we call a conscience, never with the ethical narrowness, conveying hints instead of life's larger limitations. For the most part, my Brownies are somewhat fantastic, like their stories hot and hot, full of passion and the picturesque, alive with animating incident, and they have no prejudice against the supernatural." Popular culture presumed Hyde's depravities to be of a sexual nature, and it was unusual for a 19th-century doppelganger story to exclude romance, sex, and the basic Oedipal triangle, but Stevenson was adamant the story was not purely about heterosexual improprieties. The harm was in Jekyll because he was a hypocrite, not because he was fond of women. But people are so filled full of folly and inverted lust that they can think of nothing but sexuality. The hypocrite let out the beast Hyde, who is no more sexual than another, but who is the essence of cruelty and malice, and selfishness and cowardice, and these are the diabolic in man, not this poor wish to have a woman that they make such a cry about. A deeper, more sinister storyline is played out in this all-male tale. Stevenson overtly stated his message was aimed at the male bourgeois. The novel, it is theorized, could be considered a vehicle to express his ambivalent feelings toward his father, that he could not consciously admit. It has also been suggested it is a manifestation of the crushing realization that his father's unfulfilled desire to become a writer was finding expression in his own life. Generally speaking, Jung observes. All the life which the parents could have lived, but of which they thwarted themselves for artificial motives, is passed on to the children in substitute form. That is to say, the children are driven unconsciously in a direction that is intended to compensate for everything that was left unfulfilled in the lives of their parents. Hatred appears in the story as the dastardliest act that Hyde committed, and one that ultimately led to his downfall. In a rageful state, Hyde clubbed to death an older man asking for directions, i.e., an older man who is lost, doesn't know the way, and is seeking advice and direction from his Hyde side. Stevenson's father Thomas failed to provide worldly direction for his son. But more importantly, Robert felt his father had cut himself off from vital life energies he needed, but despised, just as Dr. Jekyll came to despise Hyde. Stevenson believed this is what killed his father, as he conveyed in the eulogy. One could almost see the struggle between the creature of cramped hereditary conventions and environment and the man nature had intended him to be. Rage directed against the father is shown when Hyde destroys the portraits of the father in Jekyll's cabinet. Rage is also directed against legalities, the domain of personality number one, and the persona. Utterson the lawyer is emblematic of rationality and the legal profession, who, like the other men in the story, has become trapped in their pragmatic world, where none of them are able to discern the connection between their friend Dr. Jekyll and the strange Mr. Hyde they discover in his quarters. The lives of these men are empty, respectable in society, but void of joy, enthusiasm, feelings, intimacy, and any women. The relation of Stevenson's father to sex was epitomized by his support of the Magdalene Society that helped prostitutes, whose plight he blamed on men. In other words, it was the wicked, lustful behavior of men that caused women to fall. This is neurotic behavior. Relief comes from being punished for the forbidden desire. His wife, Margaret, was the ever-positive, maidenly type Thomas needed to cheer him up during his many depressive episodes. Rage was also aimed at Thomas's religious beliefs when Hyde writes blasphemies in Jekyll's biblical texts. Robert's hatred toward the conservative Christianity he was raised on harkens back to a young age when he was sickly, in pain, and survival became an internal struggle. A dedicated and devoted nurse nicknamed Cummy tended to him, but her brand of Christianity was even more severe than Stevenson's parents, and turned his already fearful world of survival into a hellish nightmare, with the devil lurking behind card games, novels, and the theater. He became convinced he would not live long and would die young, and only God could save his soul from eternal hellfire. His neurotic, hypochondriacal parents became hyper-vigilant and fretted over Robert's health. To extend his life, they spent considerable finances throughout his life to support various remedies, such as long stays in health resorts throughout Europe. A morbid connection was forged between father and son via Robert's many respiratory illnesses. Thomas had a powerful pre-Oedipal bonding with his son. He had never developed a strong, stable sense of himself, so the world as object was always a little fearful. Such is the hallmark of an anxious attachment style. Thomas had a weak ability to regulate emotions, and his ego defenses were less developed. Things are split into good and evil, with evil projected onto others and the good held onto for a positive sense of self. Robert shared many of these traits with his father, which contributed to a deep, unconscious connection with him. The double bind was that Thomas shared with his son his own playful side, an expression of his inner child, and a love of language, wit, and word, together with a childish sense of adventure. It was important to Thomas that his son embrace the same spiritual convictions because of Thomas's personality structure, i.e., his form of Calvinistic religion amplified his sense of unworthiness and provided rigid forms that structured his undeveloped personality. Robert admired the success and respect his father enjoyed, something that eluded him until late in his writing career, after the incredible success of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But he had to tread lightly around his childish, mercurial father, who was prone to irrational outbursts of temper. He cruelly berated Robert about his agnosticism, threatening to disown him, and wishing that Robert had never been born. Robert resented his father over having financial dependence on him, for his inability to support his writing interests and talents, and for his strict Calvinist religious views. When Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written, Thomas began showing signs of losing his mental abilities and wit. The old king was weakening and failing to provide his son with a strong masculine model and energy at a time when Robert was in the sickest, weakest position of his life. This love-hate relationship and Stevenson's anger and guilt played out in the connection between the respectable Dr. Jekyll and his creation, Mr. Hyde. Stated another way, and on a psychological register, it manifests as a tension between two souls, the realm of consciousness overseen by the persona at war with the alterity of the unconscious as manifested by the shadow. It was a stroke of genius for Stevenson not to specify Hyde's depravities and bestial avidities, even though one of his many literary gifts was an ability to vividly encapsulate a moment in the reader's mind. A person who saw Mr. Hyde said one look from him was so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running, and he repulsed people with a black sneering coolness like Satan. Another, who had a good look at Hyde, said, "He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point." Stevenson's descriptions of Mr. Hyde turned him into a literary Rorschach test. It was up to the individual to imagine what was evil based on his or her personal, cultural, and religious beliefs. Various journalists and psychology pundits over the years claim to have discerned a sensualist, a pleasure-loving hedonist, forbidden heterosexual acts, masturbation fantasies, etc. This is a vital element in making Stevenson's tale a timeless classic. Every generation in every culture will have an evolving sense of what is dark and despicable about elements in their culture, and with some courage, to recognize that as part of themselves. What shocked the 19th century reader was that this book was written by the famed author of beloved children's poetry and a boy's adventure story, Treasure Island. More disturbing to a culture steeped in conservative Christianity was the heinous thought that evil existed within us. The devil we imagined to be out there was really a projection of our own psychic makeup. People could no longer say, "The devil made me do it." As American comedian Flip Wilson exclaimed, we now bore the awesome responsibility for curbing the evil within ourselves and in the systems we create. This was the end point in the evolution of the gods, from existing as powerful forces out in nature and the exterior world to becoming viewed as psychological forces within ourselves. Nietzsche proclaimed, "God is dead, and we have killed him." Most frightening was the question he then raised. What water is there for us to clean ourselves? The obvious evil in the world did not conveniently disappear because people stopped believing in a God somewhere out there, and his shadow side on earth, the devil. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was the prescient construct of a literary genius that foreshadowed by 9 years Freud's first psychoanalysis of one of his own dreams in 1895, the dream of Irma's injection. Freud disturbed the world with convincing descriptions of his self-analysis and in-depth explorations of his clients' psyches that exposed the dark underbelly of our conscious lives and presentations. He described the psychic mechanisms of our Jekyll and Hyde dual nature: suppression and repression of undesirable traits, projection of our dark sides onto others followed by attacks on them, converting our psychological problems into physical symptoms, somatization, etc. Jung woke up the British public when his face-to-face interview was broadcast on BBC television on October 22, 1959. "The only real danger that exists is man himself," he said. His psyche should be studied because we are the origin of all coming evil. Jung saw evil as the archetypal core of the shadow, and furthermore stated, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human soul." That thread got a lot thinner with the recent incarnation of Mr. Hyde on the world stage, with Putin's shocking invasion of Ukraine that began on February 24, 2022. Putin is the Russian state. This man of a KGB mindset has eliminated his opposition, violently at times, and surrounded himself with yes-men who owe him their allegiance after he divvied up the riches of the former Soviet Union amongst themselves. Putin was humiliated by the fall of the USSR in 1991, and he, like many Russians, is searching for a vital sense of identity. Putin enjoys broad support from his countrymen for restoring Russia to a position of power and influence, while maintaining what he considers to be a unique Russian identity, different from the rest of Europe. Bringing the second largest European country, Ukraine, with agricultural riches and deep cultural connections, back into the Russian orbit is integral to that vision. Yale professor Tim Snyder, a historian of Central Europe, perceives an irrational dimension in Putin's behavior because he is driven by a belief that Russia and Ukraine share a unique identity. This is based on the originating myth of a warlord, Valdemar, leader of a clan of Viking slave traders called the Rus, who were converted to Christianity around the year 1000. Ukraine had 1,000 years of history, situated around Kiev, before becoming part of the Russian Empire in the late 17th century. Yet Putin's use of the past is based on a fantasy of a lost unity, what Hobsbawm and Ranger called the invention of tradition. It is Putin's heroic task to restore this idealized unity by invading Ukraine and waking up Ukrainians about their foundational mythic roots and reunifying the two countries physically and spiritually. Ukraine's drift to the west and the growth of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is separate from the Russian Orthodox Church endanger Putin's quest for unity. He sees Ukraine's interest in joining NATO as more of a threat to that unity than any militaristic danger to Russia. Putin infuses the Ukrainian invasion with the irrationality of a religious fervor, ready to sacrifice the Russian economy, demolish 3 decades of global diplomacy, and destroy Ukraine in order to save it. This is a dangerously apocalyptic vision, which Robert Ray Lifton has written about so persuasively. With Putin's increasing desperation, Mr. Hyde has manifested his most fearful aspect, that is, humanity's shadow side of our human-created scientific method, the dire threat of nuclear warfare. We suggest Putin's actions can be understood as belonging to the constellation of an archetypal imperative, imaged as Mr. Hyde. This archetypal underpinning helps us to elucidate the way in which the Russian president has dangerously created his own intoxicating potion for unity, which has tremendous psychological force and persuasiveness for many, because of his conscious mobilization of a fantasized spiritual origin myth. In other words, what analytical psychology brings to the table is a way of recognizing the psychological dimension of the toxic myth history that Putin administers to the masses. While to most of his countrymen Putin personifies a heroic ideal, aided and abetted by a tight control of the media, many external observers see the opposite. The greed that precipitated the opioid epidemic, oil companies promoting climate change denial, the murder of George Floyd, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and its threat of a nuclear holocaust. We are, and forever will be, the origin of all coming evil, an ongoing manifestation of our Mr. Hyde nature, our human nature. It is the supreme challenge of our time to work against our nature, and opus contra naturam, by becoming conscious of the shadowy other within ourselves and not demonizing and projecting it, deepening the already serious divisions in an increasingly polarized world. End. This has been a presentation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Revisited. To access the paper, which includes all references, please see the link in the notes below. Thank you for watching. Acknowledgements. We acknowledge Toni Ann Lagana for her inspiration to research the life of this fascinating author. Author bios. Dennis Merritt, Ph.D., is a Jungian analyst and eco-psychologist in private practice in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and senior member of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. His Ph.D. from Berkeley is in insect pathology, microbial control of insect pests, and he is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich. He is the author of the 4-volume series, The Dairy Farmer's Guide to the Universe, Jung, Hermes, and Eco-Psychology, and has published articles on George Floyd, COVID-19, climate change, guns and the American psyche, and archetypes in film. Website: www.jungianecopsychology.com. Kevin Liu, Ph.D., is a tenured professor and head of the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies, University of Essex. He is a former member of the Executive Committee of the International Association for Jungian Studies and a member of adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Kevin's publications include articles and chapters on Jung's relationship to the discipline of history, Arnold J. Toynbee's use of analytical psychology, critical assessments of the theory of cultural complexes, sibling relationships in the Chinese and Vietnamese diaspora, racial hybridity, and Jungian perspectives on graphic novels, films, and television. Frazer Merritt, M.S.T., University of Cambridge, currently serves as the editor for Bar Publishing in Oxford, England. He is the primary author of a Jungian interpretation of the Hunger Games, a myth that defines our times, which was published in Jung Journal, Culture and Psyche. His articles and stories can be found in the Los Angeles Review of Books blog, Left Foot Forward, and Crack the Spine's Anthology 2016.